Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Raphael Fazil. You're joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. This is the first event in this academic year, and the Talking Animal series is in fact running in its 8th year. So we're getting close to an anniversary in 2 years' time. My name is Raphael Fazil. I am the Executive Director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Before I introduce our speaker, some notes about housekeeping. The way this format works, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, is we're going to be listening to a presentation that will take somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes given by our speaker, and we'll then move to a Q&A and discussion part after the presentation. We will record the presentation itself, the talk, but not the discussion. If you want to watch it later, you can go on our website or indeed, check our YouTube channel. You'll find the recording there. Everyone's warmly invited to participate in the discussion. And if you'd like to come in, can I please ask you to use the raise hand function? You can find that under the reactions button. It just makes it easier. It goes in the sort of order in which the hands are raised, and I can then feed your questions or comments directly to our speaker, or indeed you can ask them yourself, your questions and comments. If you prefer using the chat function, you can do that too. Maybe you're traveling, maybe it's easier for you, so feel free to use the chat too. But if you can, I would encourage you to use the raise hand function. It makes for a nicer discussion, I think. Okay, I will keep everyone's microphones muted unless they are making a comment or a question when they raise their hands. Okay, I think with this out of the way, it is now my pleasure to introduce our fantastic speaker tonight or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you may be joining us from. And that's David Peña-Guzmán. David Peña-Guzmán is Associate Professor of Humanities at San Francisco State University. Before joining San Francisco State, David was at Emory University, where he earned his PhD in philosophy in 2015. David specializes in animal studies, the history of the philosophy of science, French philosophy, and theories of consciousness. He is the author of the wonderful book, When Animals Dream, The Hidden World of Animal Consciousness, which was published by Princeton University Press last year. If my bookshelf behind me wasn't such a mess, I could actually find my copy of David's book and show it to you. It's a beautiful book, and I would encourage you all to get a copy if you haven't got one yet. David's also the co-author of Chimpanzee Rights, The Philosopher's Brief, which was published by Routledge in 2019. And in addition to having written many articles, David also talks to the general public, quite literally. In fact, he's the co-host of the very popular philosophy podcast, Overthink. Today, we've got the pleasure of having David with us, talking to us about animal imagination in his presentation entitled The Fantastical Animal. David, thanks so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who is taking the time to be here. I know we are managing different time zones. I myself am in Paris, France at the moment. So you might see the evening turn by the shifting grays in the background, but hopefully not in a very dramatic or distracting way. So the first thing that I need to do is to make sure that you can see my presentation. So let me share my screen and then we can begin. Do people see this?
Yes, we can see it.
And you can hear me just fine, just to make sure?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let me just begin by thanking the center for the invitation to be here. I'm very happy. Today, I'm going to be talking about the dreams of non-human animals, and I'm going to be doing so with a specific focus on what the dream worlds of other critters might teach us about the realm of animal imagination. Imagination here understood as a kind of mental power or faculty or capacity that is closely associated to what the Greeks called fantasia, hence the title of my talk today, The Fantastical Animal, which makes a reference not to animals that are themselves products of human imagination, like chimeras, but to animals that themselves have this power in their very mode of being in the world. Now, this subject, the relationship between dreams and imagination, is the topic of my book, which Raphael mentioned, When Animals Dream. So in spite of us not having a physical copy, here you have a virtual copy of the cover. When Animals Dream, The Hidden World of Animal Consciousness, which came out last year with Stanford University Press. I'm sorry, with Princeton University Press. And in this book, I explore the significance of animal dreaming using a combination of scientific research and philosophical analysis. So I position myself as a philosopher in light of my own background and experience, but I also engage a lot of psychological and neuroscientific research into animal cognition in order to arrive at some of the arguments that I want to make about the ways in which the consciousness or the minds of other animals operates. Now, in this book, I classify the evidence for believing that the evidence that we have for believing that other animals indeed dream into two large categories. We have oneric behaviors, which have to do with what the bodies of animals are doing during various phases of sleep. So here we're thinking about what their limbs are doing, what their bodies are doing, the kinds of facial gestures that they are producing or displaying, the kinds of vocalizations that we observe during sleep. And on the other hand, there is also electrophysiological data. And this is simply brain activity during sleep. Now, in connection to the first of these two categories of evidence, we can begin by thinking about the example of the cuttlefish. Cuttlefish are animals that are closely related to octopuses and that have what is known as a biphasic sleep cycle. In that regard, we are very similar to them and they are very similar to us. A biphasic sleep cycle simply means that if you look at their pattern of sleeping, that pattern every night, which recurs, can be divided into two phases, or it has a dual phase structure that is easily recognizable. They have, on the one hand, a period of slow sleep, which is what, in the case of mammals, we often call deep sleep, restorative sleep, during which not much activity is going on. There isn't a lot of behavior, there isn't a lot of neural activation. On the other hand, there is a specific phase of their sleep cycle known as the period of fast activity. And this is when, in connection to cuttlefish, their bodies begin acting up and their chromatophoric system in particular starts getting activated and making very interesting displays. And one of the questions that I ask in the book is, how do we make sense of what these displays mean in the absence of a shared language with other species? Now, what I'm about to show you here is, these are frames of a video recording of a cuttlefish during the phase of sleep known as the phase of fast activity. And what we're seeing here is that in the course of 30 seconds, so we begin from 0 seconds all the way down to 30 seconds, and we see the progression of the animal. Here you see the body of the cuttlefish and how it changes sort of every 10 seconds. And what we see is that in the course of those 30 seconds, the animal undergoes a series of sudden but also global changes in its chromatophoric display. This is from an article published in 2010 on cuttlefish sleep behavior. Now, there are three things that we notice about the global changes that are happening to this particular animal. And I know that this is somewhat hard to see because it's a highly pixelated screenshot of the original publication, but bear with me here and hopefully you'll be able to zoom in on your screens to see what I'm talking about. The first thing that we do see, and it's somewhat easy, is a darkening and lightening of the entire body. So we begin with a kind of, at the top frame, and the body of the animal becomes darker, and then it becomes lighter again. So a kind of pulsation of color in terms of coloration. The second thing is that we see the emergence, and this is a little bit harder to see, of what is known as the square display. And that means that in the middle of the body right here, we begin to notice the intensification until it appears in clearer form right here of a square white patch on the back of the animal that is a quite common display for the species. Finally, we also see some interesting changes with the appearance and then disappearance of this colored eye bar. Right above the eyes, you see it here in white, then it becomes dark and it sort of blends into a kind of darkish gray. Again, I know that it's hard to appreciate the complexity in these particular frames because of the highly pixelated quality, but let me just show you the coloration that you would likely see there if we were dealing with one of these animals in the flesh. This is a different pattern. We're not talking about the white square pattern. This is what is known as the zebra display of a cuttlefish. But just to give you a sense of the vividness or the vibrancy and the intensity of the contrast of the colors that are possible for these animals by virtue of their highly sophisticated chromatophoric system. Now, we find other behaviors, these are oneric behaviors, in other species other than the cuttlefish that are always tailored to the lifestyle of those species, but that similarly indicate a dream experience. Take the case of chimpanzees. So here we're going to be jumping taxa on the evolutionary tree of life quite radically, going from cuttlefish all the way to our closest genetic relatives, the chimpanzees. In the 1990s, the primatologist Kimberly Mukabe found that chimpanzees who had been taught ASL, that is American Sign Language, would occasionally perform or carry out ASL signs during sleep. As they enter their what is known as REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is the period of fast behavioral and neural activity in mammals, there are moments when these animals would simply act as if they were carrying out some kind of conversation with, let's say, an imaginary interlocutor that did not exist in their physical surroundings. And in these cases, they would make ASL signs that were legible enough for human observers to understand in terms of their referent. In other words, they would make a sign that the humans who lived with them understood very clearly in terms of what it meant. This suggests not only that these animals were dreaming, having a full-blown, let's say, subjective reality that was playing with a cinematographic quality inside their minds at this particular moment, but also that those dreams, those internal simulations of reality, were likely to include communicative and therefore social dynamics, in this case, language communication through ASL. It's very likely that these animals studied by Mukabe were dreaming of chatting either with their human caretakers or with other chimpanzees. Because one interesting thing about chimpanzees that are raised or trained to communicate via ASL is that even though they learn this from humans, they then take it and apply it to other chimpanzees. So they start talking amongst themselves with this human convention. Now, so as to not get lost in the weeds here, let me note that in the book, I talk about a lot of other species of animals that display species-specific oneric behaviors. We're talking about zebrafish. So we're talking about marine animals. We're talking about cats. We're talking about the platypus, about rats, and also about birds, whom you see on the upper right-hand corner, and about which I'll say a few more things in a minute. And from this pretty radical diversity, I would say, of animals that display signs and indices of an internal dream phenomenology, I draw the conclusion in my book that endogenous dream sequences must be much more widespread throughout the animal kingdom than previously imagined, extending across seemingly impassable evolutionary distances. So if you visualize the tree of life, think about how far we're jumping between birds, fish, cephalopods like cuttlefish, and mammals like humans, chimpanzees, dogs, cats, and so on. And all of this that I've mentioned so far is only on the basis of behavioral evidence, of those oneric behaviors that I said represent one of the two categories of evidence that we currently have for believing that other animals are also dreamers. But in the book, I also talk about that second category, which is electrophysiological data. Now, I focus in my discussion on electrophysiological data on what is known as mental replay, which is a complex neuronal event that occurs while animals are taking their Z's, and that is a particularly good indicator of non-human dream phenomenology. This kind of replay, mental replay, has been recorded in many vertebrates, including mammalian and non-mammalian species. For example, we know that zebra finches, I said I would return to them in a minute, and here we are. Zebra finches, which are birds native to Australia, they engage in mental replay during REM sleep in such a way that we have been able to deduce that what they're doing is they are replaying their song while they are asleep. So zebra finches have to learn a particular song that is part of their social lives. And one of the challenges that they have to crack over the course of their lives is how to memorize that song, because it's not genetic, it is not inborn. They have to pick it up through experience. And what researchers have discovered is that one of the mechanisms that these animals rely on in order to rehearse it, to practice it, and to really master it is to practice it while they are asleep. And not just unconsciously. A lot of memory consolidation is unconscious during sleep, but in this case, it happens through actually dreaming about rehearsing this song. We also have the case of rats, who also, like finches, engage in a particular form of replay, except their form of replay is not acoustic, it is spatial. Rats will mentally reconstruct their physical surroundings during sleep in such great detail that scientists can now tell which position of their imagined or dreamt maze, the spatial arrangement that they are dreaming about at any particular moment, they are in simply by looking at nothing more than neural activation patterns. In other words, we can look at brain activation patterns in these animals, and based on which specific cells, especially in the hippocampus, which ones are firing, we can make very high fidelity predictions about what position of the represented space they are in at that particular moment. Now, I myself am not a scientist. I am a philosopher who is interested in animal consciousness. And the argument that I make in this book through close readings of these protocols on mental replay is that mental replay raises fascinating philosophical questions about the animal mind. In particular, it raises questions about animal memory, since animals cannot replay episodes unless they have previously stored them in some kind of memory bank or memory archive. And so by beginning from dreams, the dreams of other species, we find this path to study something that is closely connected to dreams, but that is not equivalent to it, and that is animal memory. I also argue that electrophysiological research on mental replay raises also interesting questions about this concept of animal desire. And my claim here about animal desire is based primarily on a 2015 article by a group of scientists at University College London in the UK. Here, let me paint a picture for you. A group of researchers introduced a group of rats to a maze that the rats could explore. Except that there was a particular junction in the maze that was blocked off by a transparent barrier. And the maze had the shape of a T. So imagine something like this. Sorry, it's very cold in Paris at the moment, so I have gloves indoors. I just realized I didn't think I was going to show this hand. But it has a T-shaped, it's a T-shaped maze. And the animals were free to explore the base of the maze, but not the two arms coming out of the T, because it was blocked by a transparent barrier. Does that make sense? That they were free to move up and down the primary arm, but they only had visual, though not physical, access to the rest of the maze. Now, the researchers then decided to motivate one of the little arms of the T maze by introducing a reward. In this case, they used a pile of rice, which is a snack that rats really like in laboratory settings. And this motivated that arm by attaching the animal's desire to that particular branch of space. What happened next is that when the rats were awake and they were exploring the maze, they would come up to the junction, right to the border of that transparent line. They would look at an angle at the rice that they desired, and they started mentally pre-playing. So this is a different form of replay that moves forward rather than backwards. They started projecting mentally what it would be like for them to explore the part of the maze that they didn't have access to. So they had already represented that space cognitively because they had visual access. And so we were able to tell, based on neural activation data, that what they were imagining was the motor program of literally walking up to the much desired yummy snack. Now, then, as part of the same experiment, the researchers, here is the experiment conducted by Freyja Olafsdottir and her team of researchers. What happened then is that the researchers allowed the animals to take a nap. And what did they find in these cases? They found that the animals started dreaming of exploring precisely the forbidden part of the maze, showing that desire not only takes reign of their cognitive process when they are awake and in the maze, but also of the cognitive process when they are asleep and in REM sleep. And the reason they were able to make this inference is because the neural pattern of activation during REM sleep was exactly the same as the one that they enacted when they were looking at their desired piece, at the desired object without having access to it. And so during REM and during projecting, the brain signature was identical. Now, in the book, I note that this particular discovery means that we need to bring into the conversation of animal experience Freud's theory of dreams as wish fulfillment. Because at least in the case of these rats, the dreams of these animals were imaginary realizations of otherwise truncated desires. It was in dreams that these animals were able to realize a desire that, quote unquote, the reality principle had put just out of reach. Now, beyond memory and desire, I think that research on mental replay also raises really interesting questions about non-human imagination. Since animals, when they dream, reconstruct an episode from past experience in the absence of the relevant stimulus, which means that they are bringing to mind something that is not there in their immediate surroundings. And this is something that requires imagination. Beyond simply mental recall being in itself an imaginative act, we also know from research on hippocampal replay, my apologies, that there are some animals, and this has been observed a couple of times, who can dream after being exposed to a particular spatial maze with a particular arrangement that they have already cognitively mapped, that when they fall asleep and they go into REM sleep, they start mentally replaying spatial arrangements or spatial pathways in that maze that they have never experienced before, and also pathways that don't actually exist in reality. In other words, the animals map the real space, and then they come up with what are known as shortcuts. And then they replay or pre-play the activity of moving through those imaginary shortcuts as a way of mastering their relationship to this space. Now, here I want to stay with the topic of imagination a little bit longer, and see where it takes us in our thinking about the minds of other animals. And what you're seeing here is a painting by Gilles Ayot, who is a French painter who died in 2005. And I recently went to the Centre Pompidou here in Paris, France, to see an exhibit on his work. And a lot of his paintings are about animals. They are about violence and about the relationship between violence and imagination in particular. And so I'm here just using his painting as a representation of imagination, figuration in connection to the figure of the animal. But imagination, for me as a philosopher, is quite thought-provoking because it is exceptionally difficult to define. And even when it is definable, it is very difficult to circumscribe. But in rough and ready terms, we can say that the imagination refers to the ability to represent an object, a person, or an event that is either absent or that is irreal. So when we imagine something, it's something that's not there or something that simply does not exist. And moreover, not only are we representing that object, person, or event, but we're also suspending our normal ways, or the normal ways in which we would interact with that object, with that person, or with that event if we were to encounter it in the flesh. And that means that to imagine is essentially to presentify what is absent to oneself, or to realize what is irreal through a mental act of conjuring, and to do so in order to explore that thing in a novel way. Now, research in animal cognition, in comparative ethology, and also in the field of animal behavior suggests that we humans are not the only earthlings with impressive imaginations. Behaviors that are now considered to be reliable evidence of imaginative capacities in non-human animals include dreams, since dreams are inherently imaginative, and this is the core of my argument in my book. But then there are these other ones that I touch upon in my writing, but only slightly and without going into great detail. These include pretense, when animals quote unquote lie or pretend as if something were the case when in reality they understand that it is not the case. Play behaviors, when animals create a phantasmagoric scenario in which typical social norms are suspended and even violated for the sake of either comic relief or simply a kind of catharsis that is appropriate to play itself. And also, according to some people, mind reading. Mind reading here meaning theory of other minds, the ability to understand that other organisms have a perspective of their own that is different from my own. That kind of base for empathy for a lot of theorists of intersubjectivity, empathy, mind reading requires a kind of imaginative leap or projection. And of course, creativity in general. So all of these behaviors we now take to be indicators of this kind of creative power in other animals that goes by the name of fantasia. Now, from this diversity of behaviors, we can deduce a few things about the imagination itself as it expresses itself across the animal kingdom. The first thing that we can deduce is that imagination is not, as we often think, an isolated mental function. Rather, it is a spectrum of activities and performances that appear under various guises in the lives of all kinds of animals. The imagination plays a role in the formation of mental images and mental states such as perceptions, beliefs, memories, and hallucinations. And it also guides the enactment of complex social behaviors, as in the case of play and pretense. The philosopher Nigel Thomas has organized this vast spectrum of imagination using a model that locates any imaginative act somewhere in a space that is created by three axes, which are the following: an axis of presence versus absence, an axis of will or voluntary control, and an axis of the old human dimension of vivacity or vividness. Now, here is the model that I'm talking about, this three-dimensional model for thinking about the multi-dimensionalness of the imagination itself. And essentially what you have here is a red axis. This is my own visual rendition of Thomas's model. This is not his own rendition, but this is what his model amounts to. And so let me just talk a little bit about this way of thinking about the imagination. So this is the space of imagination. And whenever you think about any mental or behavioral act that has an imaginative component, it will fall somewhere in the space created by this model. And you just have to identify its level of presence versus absence, will or subjective control, and vividness. So for example, dreams. Dreams would have less presence. So on the x-axis, we would move in this direction because the things that we dream about are not present to us physically in our surroundings. So they have less presence. They are on this side of the model. They have less control or less an attenuated sense of will, because we don't really control our dreams. We just sort of endure them and we're there for the ride. And that's very different than other forms of imagining where you can control the mental imagery at will. So they would be also lower on the Y scale. And finally, they would have a very high degree of vividness because our dreams have this, again, almost cinematographic level of detail that is multisensorial as well. And so dreams would be somewhere in this quadrant over here. On the other hand, something like memory would have less presence, like dreams, because you can remember things that are not there at all, but you would have more control. So you then would move onto the positive side of the will axis and maybe a lower sense of vividness because our memories tend to be less visually detailed than our dreams. And the same thing for something like a normal perception, according to Thomas. Even a normal perception, like the fact that I'm perceiving my screen right now, he says that contains an imaginative creative element because my nervous system sort of unifies all the perceptions into a coherent percept. And so that would have more presence because it's literally in front of me. It would have less control because the object as it exists in reality sort of determines my perception of it. And it would have the highest level of vividness. Now, let's talk about a second thing that I believe we can infer about imagination based on this vast diversity of forms that it can take. And that is that imagination might mean that animals can tell the difference on a very fundamental level between reality and between what is real and what is imaginary, even if they cannot talk about it using human style language, and even if they don't conceptualize that distinction in the same ways that we do. And there is no better sign that they have this power of judgment, of judging reality itself, which I think is something quite extraordinary when we think about it, than the fact that whenever they engage in a mental act or a behavioral performances that requires or entails imagination, their relationship to the world changes because they are able to separate imaginary from real scenarios. Among cognitive scientists, this separation or this hiving off of the fantastical from the empirical has a name. It is called quarantine. To perform any imaginative act, an animal has to create a sort of mental frame of fantasy, and then they are able to explore this frame, doing so without forgetting that it is a frame and without making too many errors, and indeed sometimes no errors at all, about where the lines are between one mental frame and another. For example, when animals play, so think about two dogs playing with one another, just running around the house and kind of like fake biting one another and taking turns being the dominant partner. When animals play, they are creating a phantasmagoric field of interaction where typical social norms are suspended in favor of playful interactions that often culminate not just in the ignoring of social norms, but in the inversing of those social norms. So sometimes you will have the little dog take the position of the dominant dog and of the physically larger dog self-handicapping and pretending to be sort of like bulldozed over by the little dog. So social norms are inverted or almost in a carnivalesque manner during moments of play. Yet these animals have no problem, quote unquote, turning off the phantasmagoric performance if the surrounding environment suddenly demands it. And that is because when they are performing an imaginary mental quarantine, again, creating that frame of right now I am performing a fantastical element, they are representing a behavior. They are not manifesting it. They're not doing it. They are doing something with an understanding of its imaginary status. And so that's the difference between representing versus manifesting. They are staging those behaviors either for themselves or for a third party, like an actor rehearsing a play. And this suggests, I argue, an awareness of the difference between what is real and what is not. Quarantining, cognitive quarantining, moreover, suggests that animals move through the world shifting mental frames, i.e., donning different attitudes towards reality. A perceptual attitude now, a fantastical one later. These attitudes, as I understand them, are different modes of relating to reality, or borrowing some more philosophical languages, different ways of positing reality. So the animals posit something at one moment as real and interact with it in that way. At other times, they posit something as imaginary and relate to it in the way that is appropriate in light of that positing. But the thing about frames is that they're not always 100% sturdy. And the same thing happens with these cognitive frames. There are cases where an imaginative act spills over the frame of its own enaction and ends up contaminating the post-imaginative state of the imaginer. In other words, there are cases where we create a frame, we imagine something in that frame, either through memory, through hallucination, or through dreaming, and then that thing has certain effects that continue even after we exit that frame and switch onto another frame. And this is what the philosopher Tomar Sabo-Gendler calls imaginary or imaginative contagion. Imaginative contagion in humans occurs when an imaginative act has consequences that surpass the duration of the act itself and have downstream effects on the subject. For example, I'm going to give a few that he talks about in his work. For example, we know that when you look at something for a long time in perception, once it's taken away, it can lead to a negative after image. This is a very common sort of like visual illusion that people have. If you look at a certain flag for a long time, It affects the retina in a particular way. You take away the stimulus and the subject feels as if they're seeing a negative after image. I assume people might be familiar with some of this psychological research. Or if you look at a light for a long time and then you take it away, you see a kind of black spot where the light used to be, even though there is no black spot. The really fascinating thing is that researchers have found out that negative after images can happen not just when we see a particular stimulus and it's taken away, but when we visually imagine that stimulus and then stop thinking about that stimulus. The imagination can actually affect the phenomenology of my experience of the world after I stop the imaginative performance with an actual after image. Another example of imaginative contagion is research into what are known as motor routines. A lot of this research has been done with skiers, that if you have a skier that has to go down a particular path and you want to improve their performance, the best thing that you can do is have them mentally replay or pre-play the things that their body would have to do in the order in which their body would have to do it right before they do the performance. And if you have them do that imaginative act, statistically speaking, they will perform better when they go ahead and do it. And so the imagination of the pathway has this downstream effect that it actually improves the performance once the skier has shifted from imagination to reality. And of course, there are also examples of this contagion at the level of affect. Because when I imagine something, when I bring something up to mind through this kind of conjuring power that I have as an imaginer, it can activate sentiments, emotions, feelings, affects that continue for a long time after I stop imagining the thing. And that have these effects that linger for a long time. So if I think of a particularly upsetting memory, the effect of thinking about that will continue even after I decide to think about something else, that deep sense of discomfort, that knot at the base of my stomach. So in this case, we're talking about imagination having affective downstream effects. Finally, this is the last example I will give. All of these are from Gendler's work. There are cognitive forms of imaginative contagion, since imagined content can sometimes prime us to think in certain ways by unconsciously activating clusters of concepts that affect our comportment and our reasoning, but of which we are unaware. So let's say that I, again, imagine something, that content might trigger unconscious associations that have that contagion effect down the road. Now, and by the way, this is just a Dali painting that is often used to talk about the unconscious or to visually represent the unconscious, here understood as sort of cabinets, hidden cabinets within the self. Now, according to Gendler, one feature of consciousness itself explains all these cases of imaginative contagion. And that is what he calls source indifference. This simply means that mental access is, as he puts it, conspicuously source indifferent. Once an object, person, or event enters the mind starts working on it and with it without paying attention to its point of origin. Did it come from me or did it come from the world? It doesn't matter. Without batting an eye, the mind gets to work. Although right now, we don't know if all the forms of imaginative contagion that Gendler talks about apply to non-human animals, I believe that some of them probably do. And I also think that dreams are a case in point for helping us think about that really tricky question. I mean, already thinking about what other animals imagine is methodologically very thorny because of the question of access. How do we access these internal quote unquote purely mental performances, but then moreover, how would we even talk about the effects that they have on the cognitive, emotional, and social lives of animals? But here, bear with me as we think about two cases. Those are motor routines and affect. Now, in the case of dreaming, as we've seen, many of the dreams of animals are motor routines. In the case of zebra finches dream of the physical movements that they would go through mentally, the physical movements that they would have to do in order to rehearse their song. Similarly, rats during REM sleep, they dream of the motor routine needed to get to the yummy piece of rice or to explore the new pathway that they've invented very cleverly as a way of making a shortcut. So a lot of dreams are motor routines. They are the animal in terms of its body doing something in a particular spatial configuration. The second case here is affect. And the things that animals dream about when they fall asleep tend to alter their affective state during sleep. They change their heart rates. They give a lot of physiological indicators that something is either going well or that something is not going so well, especially when we're talking about indices of stress or fear. And sometimes the physiological changes that are brought about by a dream can be so clear that we can infer that an animal is having a negatively valence dream, that they're dreaming of something quite unpleasant. They start making facial gestures, their heart starts racing. It's clearly the case that emotionally, the animal has moved toward the negative end of the spectrum. Sometimes these changes are so extreme and so acute that they actually have the power to put an end to the dream itself. In other words, they end that mental frame in which they happen. Now, I won't go into detail about this now, but I'm happy to answer questions about this. I think a good example of this, which I do talk about in the book, is the case of animal nightmares. We now believe that there is enough evidence to talk about nightmares in rats, in elephants, and in other in non-human primates. These are cases where animals retain in memory episodes that are extremely painful, that then they replay in the context of sleep, and that wake these animals up, often deregulating their sleep architecture and culminating in what people are now calling non-human PTSD, especially when the trauma is particularly intense for these animals. Most of this research does come out of observations of elephant behavior, elephants that have been traumatized by, for example, the ivory trade, in that they witnessed their mother or their siblings get butchered. Then they develop post-traumatic chronic nightmares. And when they wake up from these nightmares, the affective impact continues for a long time. Again, this case of an imaginary performance hemorrhaging into the real world, meaning that we can draw a very clean separation between what happens in the dreaming world and what happens in the waking world. Now, I mentioned imagination, quarantining, and contagion here simply to underscore the point that paying closer attention to all the expressions of animal consciousness can reveal hitherto unimagined heights and depths in the experience of other critters. As I put it in my book, speaking specifically in connection to dreams, it is hard to deny that dreams push us to new frontiers in the study of animal consciousness, frontiers where the lines between the human and the non-human, the existential and the biological, the transcendent and the immanent begin to blur. Now, let me conclude here with just a final note on ethics and law. Although this book is primarily about the minds of other animals and about this philosophical notion of consciousness, it is motivated first and foremost by moral concerns. I believe that the dreams of other Earthlings are meaningful not only because they make us wonder about the mental power of the many other animals with whom we share the world, but also because they crystallize for us the moral status of non-human dreamers. In the final chapter of the book, which is about ethical theory, I draw a connection, and it's somewhat complicated, so I won't be able to go into detail about it here. For that, you'll have to read that chapter of the book. But I contend that dreams have a certain moral force that has not really been recognized in the literature, and that grants any creature who dreams what ethicists and legal theorists call moral status. And so I take dreaming to be a sufficient, although not a necessary, condition for moral status. And of course, moral status is a foundational concept in moral theory and the philosophy of law that tracks those creatures who are bearers of moral and, by extension, legal rights or protections. Again, I present this here only as a concluding remark, and I'm happy to talk about it more. But the book does try to make this connection, beginning with science, moving through philosophy, and finally ending on ethics and law, as a way of showing what you can do with a particular behavior, in the case of non-human animals, in this case, dreaming, once you think about it from an interdisciplinary perspective. I will stop here. Thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions that people might have.